Hi, I'm David. Welcome to a tale, and a special one, because this week is the 4th of July. Once a week on this channel, we tell a true story from history, told slow enough to fall asleep to, and tonight, it is the strangest true story America has. Two founders, best friends, then bitter enemies, then friends again, died on the very same day, July 4th, 1826, 50 years to the day after the declaration they made together. Every word of it is documented, and the sources are listed below. There are no ads waiting to wake you, and I can promise you right now that this story ends in peace. So settle in, get comfortable, and happy 4th of July. Good night. Close your eyes now, if you like. This is a story, and it is true, and it asks nothing of you except that you lie still and let it happen. And before we begin it, let me give you the ending, the whole ending, straight away, because tonight the ending is not something to be protected. Tonight the ending is the reason the story exists at all. There were once two men who made a country together. One was short and round and talkative, a farmer's son from Massachusetts who argued the way other men breathe. The other was tall and quiet and graceful, a planter's son from Virginia who could put words on paper the way light comes through a window. One of them stood up in a hot room in Philadelphia and talked a continent into independence, and the other sat down at a small wooden desk and wrote out why, in sentences the world has never stopped saying. They were best friends. Then the country they made broke the friendship, and for 12 years they did not speak, and the silence between Massachusetts and Virginia was the saddest quiet in America. And then, as old men, they found their way back to each other, letter by letter, 158 letters, until everything between them was warm again, and each of them knew it. And then came the ending that no storyteller would dare to invent. On the 4th of July, 1826, 50 years to the day after the Declaration of Independence, both of them died, the same day. Thomas Jefferson at Monticello in Virginia, a little after noon. John Adams at Quincy in Massachusetts, as the evening came on, 500 miles apart, each in his own bed, each with his family around him, each at peace, and neither knowing anything about the other. When the news finally traveled the roads and the rivers and arrived in one astonished peace, the country decided that this was not a coincidence at all, but a blessing said out loud, and in 200 years it has never really changed its mind. And there is one more turn to it, which you will hear tonight in full. 17 years before it happened, a friend of both men dreamed this exact ending. The friendship restored, the letters flowing again, the two old rivals leaving the world almost together, and he wrote his dream down in a letter that survives to this day. So, nothing that happens in this story can go wrong in the end. You know the harbor now. Both ships come home on the same tide. Let the story take its time. John Adams came first, born in the autumn of 1735 in a farmhouse at the foot of a low green hill in Braintree, Massachusetts, in the part of town that would later take the name Quincy. His father was a farmer and a deacon, and John loved him all his life. The boy grew up short, sturdy, and round, and loud in the way some small men are loud, not from vanity, though he had that too, but from sheer pressure of thought. Words gathered in him like weather. He went to Harvard, took up the law, and turned out to be very good at it, because the law is an argument with rules, and John Adams was the finest arguer in Massachusetts, and he wrote everything down. His diary is one of the great honest documents of that century, because he confessed to it nightly. His ambition, his envy, his temper, the days he talked too much, and knew it even while he was doing it. Hold that about him. That kind of honesty is a form of courage, and it will matter at the end of this story. In 1764, he married Abigail Smith, a minister's daughter with no formal schooling and one of the finest minds in America, and it was the best decision either of them ever made, and both of them said so in writing across 54 years. Thomas Jefferson was born 8 years after Adams, in the spring of 1743, at a plantation called Shadwell in the hill country of Virginia, where the land gathers itself up toward the Blue Ridge. His father was a surveyor and a mapmaker, a huge, quiet, famously strong man, and Thomas worshipped him and lost him at 14. The son grew tall, 6 feet 2.5, slim, with reddish hair and freckles, and a way of leaning back from the world, even while he studied everything in it. He played the violin. He read the way other men eat, and he hated arguing face to face, truly hated it, all his life. When something had to be said, he wrote it instead, and what he wrote had a music no one else in America could match. As a young man, he chose a small mountain near his birthplace and decided he would level the top of it and build his house there, looking west over the blue folds of Virginia. He called it Monticello, which is Italian for little mountain, and he never stopped building it because it was not really a house. It was a self-portrait, and he was never finished with either. And here, early, is the one honest sentence this story must carry the whole way, because our accuracy promise covers founders too. Monticello was built, worked, and kept beautiful by enslaved people, and Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that all men are created equal, held human beings in bondage his entire life, knew the contradiction perfectly well, wrote about it, and never resolved it. We cannot untangle that tonight, and we will not pretend it away. It stands in the picture where it belongs, the shadow on the little mountain. So there they are. A short, round, talkative northern lawyer who argued like a summer thunderstorm, and a tall, quiet, elegant southern planter who was silent in company and fearless on paper, like a long June evening that will not quite end. Two kinds of weather. The wonder is that they ever met at all. The greater wonder is what they made when they did. They met in Philadelphia in 1775 at the Second Continental Congress, with the war already begun up in Massachusetts. Jefferson was 32, one of the youngest men in the room, and had arrived, Adams remembered, with a reputation for literature that ran ahead of him. Adams was nearly 40 and was already the engine of the whole floor, the man who stood up again and again in that hot room and pushed the delegates, vote by vote, toward the one word nobody wanted to say first: independence. He noticed that the tall Virginian almost never spoke. I never heard him utter 3 sentences together, Adams said later, but he had also noticed that in the small committees, out of the glare, Jefferson was prompt, frank, and decisive, and that everything he drafted came out clean and shining. The talker and the writer took each other's measure and liked what they found. In June of 1776, the Congress appointed a committee of 5 to draft a Declaration of Independence and put both of them on it, along with old Benjamin Franklin. And here the story arrives at one of the most famous conversations in American history. And the accuracy promise requires a small lantern held up to it first. The account comes from Adams himself, writing almost half a century later, and Jefferson remembered the mechanics a little differently: more votes, less theater. But Adams told it the same way every time he told it, and it sounds so exactly like both men that the historians mostly stand aside and let him talk. So let him talk. Jefferson proposed that Adams write the draft. Adams refused. Jefferson asked him why. "Reason first," said Adams. "You are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can. You can write 10 times better than I can." Vain, prickly, hungry John Adams, who wanted glory and confessed it to his diary nightly, looked at the greatest writing prize of the age and handed it away with both hands, because the sentence was true and he knew it. It may be the most generous thing he ever said. Nearly everything else in this story grows out of it. So Jefferson went back to his rented rooms on the second floor of a bricklayer's house at the edge of town, set a small folding writing desk on his knees, a desk he had designed himself, and in 2 weeks of June evenings, in the thick heat of a Philadelphia summer, he wrote out a declaration. He was 33 years old. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." He wrote that, on his knees, in a rented room, a shy man who could not make a speech. Then the Congress edited him, the way committees have always edited writers. They cut a quarter of the text, and Jefferson sat through it in silence, and suffered the way only a writer edited in public can suffer. Old Franklin, sitting beside him, leaned over and comforted him with a gentle, funny story about a hatmaker's sign that helpful friends edited down until nothing remained of it but a picture of a hat. And while Jefferson sat and endured, it was Adams, over and over, for the better part of 2 days, who rose and defended the draft on the floor, fighting for another man's sentences as if they were his own children. Jefferson never forgot it. Decades later, he called Adams the Colossus on the floor of that Congress, the pillar of the Declaration's support, and its ablest advocate and defender. Look at the pair of them for a moment. The man who wrote it could not speak for it. The man who could speak for it had given away the writing of it. Between them, they made exactly one complete founder, and they both knew it. The vote for independence carried on the 2nd of July. The finished declaration was adopted 2 days later on the 4th. Adams, blazing with joy, wrote to Abigail that the great day would be celebrated by generations to come, with pomp and parade, with games and guns and bells and bonfires and illuminations, from one end of the continent to the other, forevermore. He was right about everything except the date, because he meant the 2nd of July, the day of the vote. The country chose instead the date printed at the top of Jefferson's paper, the 4th. So the 4th of July was, in a quiet way, Jefferson's date, and not Adams's. Remember that. In the end, even the calendar insisted on both of them. The war took 8 years, and it scattered them. Adams crossed the ocean to argue America's case in Europe, which he did the way he did everything, tirelessly and without much tact. Jefferson stayed in Virginia, served as its governor through the worst of the fighting, and then, in 1782, his world caved in. His wife Martha died that September. He had promised her, the family said, that he would never marry again, and he never did. For 3 weeks he shut himself in his room and paced, and his little daughter Patsy stayed inside that room with him, never a moment from his side, and remembered the pacing all her life. He burned nearly every letter the two of them had exchanged, and so history knows almost nothing about that marriage except the size of the hole it left. In 1784, the Congress sent him to Paris to join Franklin and Adams in representing the new republic, and there, in a foreign country, the friendship became a family. The Adamses kept a house out at Auteuil, on the edge of the city, and Jefferson dined there so often that a place at their table was simply his. Abigail, who did not hand out her esteem cheaply, decided that the tall widower was one of the choice ones of the earth, and said so in her letters. Young John Quincy Adams, 17 years old, walked the bookstalls of Paris beside Jefferson so constantly that his father would say, looking back years later, that the boy had seemed almost as much Jefferson's son as his own. When the Adamses moved to London in 1785, Abigail wrote to Jefferson himself that he was the only person with whom her companion could associate with perfect freedom and unreserve. For years afterward, the two households ran errands for each other across the channel, shirts and books and table linens, and the letters from those years read like family mail, because that is what they were. In the spring of 1786, Jefferson crossed to London, and the two friends did something almost nobody remembers now. They took a holiday together, a carriage tour of the English countryside, two middle-aged American revolutionaries, rolling from famous garden to famous garden, taking notes on hedges. At Stratford, they were shown the birthplace of Shakespeare, and a chair said to have been Shakespeare's own, and, following the custom of visitors, they cut a small sliver from it to keep, like a pair of schoolboys. Adams noted in his diary that they cut off a chip according to the custom, and Jefferson, labeling his chip afterward, added dryly that if the chair was truly Shakespeare's own, then like the relics of the saints, it must be able to reproduce itself. It is the happiest picture in the whole friendship. Remember them there, in the green of an English June, whittling a relic they did not quite believe in, laughing. And one more picture, the tenderest one. In 1787, Jefferson's younger daughter Polly, 8 years old, crossed the Atlantic to join him, and the ship delivered her first to London, to Abigail. Within days, the small homesick stranger had fastened herself to Abigail's heart, and Abigail to hers, and when Jefferson's steward came to carry Polly on to Paris, the little girl cried, and Abigail cried. The two families had grown into each other, like trees planted close. Nothing seemed less likely than that these people could ever be enemies. They came home to the new Constitution and to jobs at the top of it. Washington was president. Adams was vice president. Jefferson was Secretary of State. And then the weather changed. Across the ocean, France rose in revolution, and the two friends read the same newspapers and saw two different futures. Jefferson saw the American fire spreading, liberty catching from candle to candle, and forgave the flames almost everything. Adams saw the mob and the guillotine coming before it came, and could not understand how his friend could look at blood and see sunrise. Around those two ways of seeing, the whole country slowly sorted itself into parties. Federalists gathering around Adams's kind of caution, Republicans around Jefferson's kind of hope, though every man of that generation swore he despised faction. They built the machine that would grind up their own friendship. The first wound came in 1791 by accident, when a private note of Jefferson's, regretting certain political heresies that had sprung up among us, was printed without his permission at the front of a pamphlet, and every reader in America understood the heresies to mean the writings of John Adams. Jefferson had not meant it for print. It read no softer for that. Then came the election of 1796, which Adams won by 3 electoral votes. And under the odd original rules, the second man became vice president, so Jefferson served under the friend he had just run against. Courtesy dwindled into distance, while advisors on both sides, smaller men with sharper elbows, poisoned the well a bucket at a time. And then came 1800, the rematch, one of the ugliest elections in all of American history. We will keep the mud at a distance, because it does not belong in a bedtime story, and because neither man's hands were clean, and neither man's hands held the shovel. It is enough to say that hired pens called Adams things no one should print, and pulpits warned that a vote for Jefferson was a vote against God himself, and that each of the 2 old friends believed, in his wounded heart, that the other had paid for the whip that struck him. Jefferson won. And there's a grief folded inside that winter that history often forgets to count. While the votes were being tallied, John Adams' son Charles, 30 years old, gentle and lost, and ruined by drink, died in New York. Adams lost the presidency and a child in the same season, and moved through the last weeks of his term like a man walking in his sleep. On the morning of the 4th of March, 1801, at 4 o'clock, while the sky was still dark, the public stage rolled north out of the raw new capital city, and John Adams was on it, going home to Abigail and the farm, and he did not stay to watch Thomas Jefferson sworn in. History has scolded him for that dawn departure for 2 centuries, and fairness asks us to say the quiet parts too. No defeated president had ever handed power to an opponent before, so there was no custom to follow. He was 65 and newly bereaved, and it is not even certain anyone properly invited him. But the picture is the picture, and the 2 men themselves never argued with it. A dark morning, a coach, a road going north, and behind it, silence. 12 years of silence. There was one false start, and it is a sad, human one. In 1804, Jefferson's daughter Polly died at 25, the same Polly who had clung to Abigail in London, and Abigail, the mother in her overruling everything else, sat down and wrote Jefferson a letter of condolence. He answered warmly, too warmly, reaching for the old friendship, and the exchange that followed touched the old wounds instead, and after a few letters, Abigail closed the door again, and for a time, John Adams did not even know it had been opened. The frost held. Jefferson finished 2 terms as president and rode home to his mountain. Adams kept his farm, read enormously, wrote crankily, and grew old. Between Quincy and Monticello, nothing moved at all. What broke the frost was a doctor. Benjamin Rush of Philadelphia, signer of the Declaration and lifelong friend to both men, had kept up a warm correspondence with each of them for years, and the silence between them sat on him like a stone. In October of 1809, he wrote to Adams and told him about a dream. He had dreamed, he said, that he was reading a page from a history of the United States written in some year yet to come, and the page told how John Adams, in his old age, sent a short friendly letter to his old friend Thomas Jefferson, and how the friendship was renewed, and how the 2 men then carried on a correspondence for years, and how at last, the dream history said, they sunk into the grave nearly at the same time. Stop on that for a moment. In 1809, 17 years early, Benjamin Rush dreamed the ending of this story, including the part no reasonable person would believe, and wrote it down, and the letter survives. He was only wishing, of course. Adams wrote back, half laughing, that a dream might turn out to be prophecy. And then he did nothing, because he was John Adams, and the first move was a high price. 2 more years passed. In the summer of 1811, 2 young Virginians, who were neighbors of Jefferson, paid a visit to the old man at Quincy, and in the flow of talk about the old days, Adams said a sentence that was carried the 500 miles home. "I always loved Jefferson," he said, "and still love him." When the words reached Monticello, Jefferson wrote to Rush that this was enough for him, that he had only ever needed to know the heart was still there. Rush, triumphant, wrote to Adams at once, all but taking him by the sleeve. And so, on New Year's Day, 1812, John Adams took up his pen. The letter was short and a little shy, the way first letters after long silences are. He wished his old friend many happy New Years, and he announced that he was sending along, by another post, 2 pieces of homespun made in his own family. Jefferson, delighted, and not waiting for the parcel, sat down and answered with a small, earnest essay on household manufacturing in Virginia, wool and cotton and looms. Then the parcel arrived, and the homespun turned out to be 2 volumes of lectures on rhetoric by Adams's son John Quincy, homespun of the Adams family loom indeed. Jefferson had been caught being earnest, which is the gentlest trap a friend can set, and he wrote again, gracefully, and it did not matter. The correspondence had begun. In that first real letter of his, Jefferson wrote the sentence that opened the gates. "A letter from you," he told Adams, "calls up recollections very dear to my mind. It carries me back to the times when, beset with difficulties and dangers, we were fellow laborers in the same cause. After everything, that was the ground both men could stand on, and they never left it again." For the next 14 years, the letters went back and forth between the farm at Quincy and the mountain in Virginia, 158 of them in all, and taken together, they are among the greatest correspondence in American history, and very possibly the warmest. Adams wrote 109 of them, and Jefferson 49. A score Adams teased him about, and Jefferson answered honestly. He was buried alive in mail from strangers, more than 1,200 letters in 1 year, by his own count, and the friend at Quincy was the correspondence he saved his best hours for. They wrote about everything, books and religion and grief and the habits of old age, and whether a man would choose to live his life over again, and what the revolution had actually meant, and how it had felt from inside. The old quarrels came up too, of course, and this is the loveliest thing about the letters. The quarrels are handled like old swords taken down from the wall, turned in the light, admired, and hung back up, never once swung. In the summer of 1813, Adams wrote the sentence that stands as the charter of the whole correspondence, and it may be the best thing he ever wrote. "You and I ought not to die," he told Jefferson, "before we've explained ourselves to each other." And so they explained themselves, at ease, at last, with nothing left to win. They wrote as old men write. Adams's hand shook worse each year, until his script sprawled like winter branches, and in time he dictated to grandchildren gathered at his table. Jefferson's right wrist, badly broken in Paris long ago, and never right again, stiffened until every page cost him, and still the pages came. In 14 years, they never once met, never heard each other's voices again. The friendship lived entirely on paper, and perhaps that is why it healed so completely, because on paper Jefferson had always been at his bravest, and Adams, strange to say, at his gentlest. Abigail added her postscripts again, small warm lines at the bottoms of pages. The door in London reopened, and then in the autumn of 1818, Abigail died of typhoid fever at 73, and the whole architecture of John Adams's life lost its central beam. The letter Jefferson wrote him then is one of the most beautiful letters of condolence in the language. He knew grief, and knew words were useless in it, and he offered the only comfort he had left. It is of some comfort to us both. He wrote that the term is not very distant at which we are to deposit in the same cerement our sorrows and suffering bodies, and to ascend in essence to an ecstatic meeting with the friends we have loved and lost, and whom we shall still love and never lose again. Adams wrote back that the letter had given him divine consolation under his great affliction, and that he believed in that meeting most undoubtingly, because he could not conceive that God would make a creature like man merely to live and die on this earth. By then they were the last two great pillars of the founding still standing, riding across 500 miles, while the country between them filled up with people who thought of them as monuments. Adams said it best and simplest in one of his late letters. While you live, he told Jefferson, I seem to have a bank at Monticello on which I can draw for a letter of friendship and entertainment when I please. The year 1826 came toward them like a lighthouse they had both been steering by. The Jubilee, 50 years since the Declaration. Adams was 90 years old, folded into his chair at Quincy, deaf in company but bright in the eyes, his mind, visitors said, undimmed. Jefferson was 83, worn thin on his mountain, his health going, his fortune already gone, for Monticello was sunk in debts he could not pay, and friends were organizing a public lottery to try to save the house around him. From Washington, the mayor, Roger Waitman, wrote to each of them inviting them to the great celebration in the Capitol on the 50th 4th. Both were too weak to travel, and both knew it, and each answered in his own perfect key. Jefferson answered with the last public letter of his life, written at Monticello on the 24th of June, and it is one of the greatest things he ever wrote, the old music entirely intact, the pen steady for one more page. The Declaration, he wrote, would be to the world the signal of arousing men to burst the chains of monkish ignorance and superstition. All eyes are opened, or opening, to the rights of man, he wrote. The general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few, booted and spurred, ready to ride them. And for ourselves, he wrote, let the annual return of this day forever refresh our recollections of these rights, and an undiminished devotion to them. 50 years after the little folding desk, the same hand, the same fire, banked now, but burning clean. Adams answered like Adams. At the end of June, a small delegation from Quincy called at the old house and asked the former president for a toast to be read aloud in his name at the town celebration on the 4th. The old man gave them 2 words, independence forever. They asked, respectfully, whether he would like to add anything to that. Not a word, said John Adams. There they are, one last time, each entirely himself. Jefferson's farewell, a long golden cord held for a full page. Adams's farewell, a single struck bell. The writer and the talker, the evening and the thunderstorm. Neither would compose another public sentence. There was nothing left to compose. There was only the day itself now, coming up the calendar toward them both. At Monticello, Thomas Jefferson took to his bed in the last days of June, and the household gathered around the fact that everyone understood and no one hurried. His daughter Patsy was there, and his grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, and Nicholas Trist, the young husband of a granddaughter, and his physician, Dr. Dungleson, and the enslaved household, who had known him all his life. He was calm. The accounts agree. He gave instructions. He said his goodbyes without drama, as a man settling accounts he had long expected to settle. Through the 3rd of July, he slept and woke and slept, the whole house keeping its quiet watch. And in the evening of the 3rd, he stirred and asked the question that the story has kept ever since. Is it the 4th? The account is Dr. Dungleson's, a physician's memory of a bedside written down afterward, and we say so, but it has never been seriously doubted. The doctor recorded his own answer too. It soon will be, he told the old man. Later that night, and this his grandson remembered, Jefferson refused the dose of laudanum that would have eased him under. No, doctor, he said, nothing more. He meant to be present, as far as a dying man could arrange it, and he held on, hour by hour, while the 3rd of July wore itself out, and midnight passed over the little mountain, and the 4th arrived in the dark, like a ship coming quietly into harbor. He lasted well into the day itself, and at 10 minutes before 1 o'clock in the afternoon, on the 4th of July, 1826, 50 years to the day after the Congress in Philadelphia adopted his declaration, Thomas Jefferson died in his bed at Monticello, with his family around him, and the summer standing at the open windows. 500 miles to the north, that same morning, John Adams woke at Quincy to a town already celebrating, bells going, cannon salutes rolling across the bay. The household story, written down afterward and kept by the family, says that when he was asked whether he knew what day it was, the old man answered, "Oh yes, it is the glorious 4th of July. God bless it. God bless you all." Toward the middle of the day, his strength left him in his reading chair, and he was carried to his bed. And through the afternoon he sank slowly and without pain or fear, while outside the windows, the town he had been born in kept the 50th forth with bells and gunpowder, and a summer thunderstorm rolled through and passed the way his whole life had. Toward evening, near the end, he stirred and spoke. And here the story must be honest with itself one last time, because this is the most famous deathbed sentence in American history, and it rests on family memory, not on paper written in the room. Those at the bedside heard him, or believed all their lives that they heard him, whisper, "Thomas Jefferson survives," the last word blurring away as he said it. Whether those were precisely the words, no one can now prove. That his last clear thought, at that hour, on that day, reached across 500 miles, to the friend on the mountain, no one in that room ever doubted, and neither, if we are honest, does anyone who has ever heard the story. And he was wrong, of course, in the plain sense. Jefferson did not survive. Jefferson had gone on ahead 5 hours before, and no living soul in Massachusetts could have known it. The two facts have lain side by side for 200 years, the sentence and the truth, and somehow the wrongness has never subtracted anything. If anything, it is the wrongness that makes it perfect, because it means the last thing John Adams did in this world was think of Thomas Jefferson and believe him alive. John Adams died at about 20 minutes past 6 in the evening, near sunset, on the 4th of July, 1826, at 90 years old, in his own bed, in the town where he was born. The same day, the same impossible day, neither of them knew. Hold that stillness for a moment, because it is the heart of this whole tale. There was no wire, no signal, no possible way for the news to fly. Just two quiet rooms, 500 miles apart, a mountain in Virginia, and a farmhouse by the Massachusetts shore. Two old men who had explained themselves to each other at last, going out on the same tide, on the 50th fourth, each with the other's name somewhere in the room, one spoken aloud at a bedside, one written 50 years before at the top of a page. In 1826, news moved at the speed of a horse, and so the country learned what had happened, the way you pour water slowly into a glass. Boston knew about Adams within hours. Virginia knew about Jefferson the same way, but each half of the country had only its own half of the story, and for days the two reports traveled toward each other, along the post roads and the packet boats, until they finally met, and editors set the two facts side by side in the same column, and people read them standing still in the street, both of them, the pen and the voice, on the 4th, on the 50th fourth. The newspapers reached, nearly every one of them, for the same word, and the word was Providence. And even the most unsentimental men of that generation found they could not entirely argue. One of those men was the President of the United States, John Adams' own son. Word of Jefferson's death on the 4th reached Washington first, and John Quincy Adams wrote in his diary that it was a strange and very striking coincidence. Then came word that his own father was failing, and he set out north at once, and learned on the road that he was too late, that his father had died that same 4th, within hours of the friend at Monticello. In his diary, the sitting president wrote that the time, the manner, the coincidence with the death of Jefferson were visible and palpable marks of divine favor, and John Quincy Adams was not a man who wrote such sentences loosely. He had known both men since he was a boy, walking the bookstalls of Paris. That August, in Faneuil Hall in Boston, Daniel Webster delivered a eulogy for the two of them together that ran above 2 hours and became at once one of the most famous speeches in American history. Adams and Jefferson are no more, he said near the beginning, and then he told their story much as we have told it tonight, the friendship, the quarrel, the letters, the day, and he said such an ending was no chance, but a mark of heaven's care for the country they had made. And the date was still not finished, because 5 years later, on the 4th of July, 1831, James Monroe, the 5th president, died as well. And so 3 of the first 5 presidents left the world on the country's birthday, as if the door stood open on that day, and they knew the way. Jefferson had written his own epitaph before the end, in his own hand, and ordered that not a word more be added. It names 3 things: author of the Declaration of American Independence, author of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, father of the University of Virginia. Nothing about having been president. By these he wrote, as testimonials that he had lived, he wished most to be remembered. All 3 were gifts he had given, and the offices he left off were gifts he had been given. He lies under that stone on the little mountain, and John Adams lies beside Abigail in the crypt of the stone church in the middle of Quincy, a mile or so from the farmhouse where he was born. Both places can be visited today. History keeps them both, and history is good at keeping when we ask it kindly. So, let the story settle now, the way supper settles, the way a summer house settles at night, a hot room in Philadelphia, and the talker handing the pen to the writer. You can write 10 times better than I can. The little folding desk on a young man's knees in the thick June heat. The colossus on the floor, defending another man's sentences for 2 days. The carriage rolling through English gardens, and 2 revolutionaries whittling a sliver from a doubtful chair, laughing. Polly, 8 years old, holding on to Abigail. Then the long winter, the coach in the dark, 12 silent years. A doctor in Philadelphia, dreaming the ending 17 years early and writing it down. 2 pieces of homespun that turned out to be books. 158 letters, the shaking hand and the stiff wrist, explaining themselves to each other at last. The palpable truth, independence forever, and not a word more. Is it the 4th? And a whisper at sunset, wrong in fact, and right in every way that matters. Thomas Jefferson survives. He does, you know. They both do. That is the quiet joke hiding inside the saddest sentence in the story. The letters survive, every one of them, kept and printed and read, so that on any night, somewhere, a lamp is lit over those pages, and the 2 voices are talking to each other still. The thunderstorm and the June evening, arguing gently about books and heaven across 500 miles of dark. So this is the image to fall asleep. Inside, the one the whole story was carrying you toward. 2 old men at 2 writing desks, far apart, late at night, each with a single candle. One writes fast, blotting, chuckling, crossing nothing out. One writes slowly, evenly, resting an aching wrist. Between them lie the roads and rivers of a young country, asleep. The letters are folded, sealed, and carried, and they always arrive safely, and they are always answered. Nothing between them is unfinished anymore. Nothing was left unsaid. They explain themselves to each other, and then, on the same warm day, in the country's 50th summer, with their families beside them and their work entirely done, they went home within hours of each other, the way old friends leave a party they came to together. Your own day is done too. Whatever it held, it is written now, and the ink is drying, and it can be read again in the morning if it needs reading, but it does not need reading tonight. The crickets have the watch, the breeze has the trees. Somewhere far off a bell, you do not need to count, is telling a town the hour. The 2 old men are at peace, and have been for 200 years, and the letters will keep, and the day they share comes round every summer like a lighthouse turning. Sleep now. Good night. History will keep till morning.